The Folly, written and read by Chris Halton. Although imparted to me by letter, this account was shared by a reputable source with impeccable references, the late Reverend Dr. L.G. Swinton. Lionel Swinton, who held a doctorate in theology at Cambridge University, was my mentor and friend when I studied there. As such, we kept in reasonably regular contact over the years, and the details I am to share are based on a written account sent to me just a few months before he passed away in 1889. Despite being the youngest son of Basil Swinton, Lord Rothmeir, a wealthy hereditary peer who held a large country estate of 1,000 acres at Rothmeir Hall in the county of Lancashire, Lionel was as far removed from this life as anyone could imagine. He was in fact a quiet, gentle, down-to-earth man of a kindly disposition, with little love for wealth or status. Lionel, second in line to the family estate, had entered the church, while Algernon, his older brother, opted for a commission in the army and later served in both India and South Africa, before succeeding to the estate and hereditary title following his father's death some 25-odd years ago. Both brothers could not be more opposite in personality. Algernon was vain and lacked empathy for anyone outside his social class, while Lionel was a warm and gregarious man who regarded all as equal under God and had even set up a charity to assist the poor while working as a priest in India. In 1885, Lionel returned to England, having been worn down by illness, age and fatigue, and was in need of somewhere to recuperate and settle into his planned early retirement. However, the adjustment was difficult, as Lionel was very much a gypsy at heart, and the thought of merely retiring to somewhere tedious and sedentary was a daunting prospect that he found difficult to embrace. In his heart, he still wanted to serve God. And it was by some good fortune that an opening for a country priest was made available to him following the death of the incumbent vicar at Rothmeir village, a parish adjunct to Rothmeir Hall, where his reclusive and older brother Algernon still resided. Neither brother had spoken to each other in several years, and upon hearing news of his brother's impending return, Algernon invited him to visit and stay for a few days before moving on and taking up his new post at Rothmeir Vicarage. The journey from London was slow and uneventful by train, and by prior arrangement, on a late and very wet June afternoon, he was met at the station by a dog cart from Rothmeir Hall. This cart took him and several pieces of luggage to the front steps of the family seat, while servant staff from the vicarage took on the remainder to his new home. Rothmeir Hall was a grand Palladian-style country house built of mellow sandstone, with a large colonnaded and pedimented entrance adorned with Roman and Greek deities. The approach to the hall was by a road lined with lime trees that spanned acres of green parkland filled with cattle and sheep, which passed over a stone bridge that spanned an elongated lake, with the rest of the estate taken up by forestry and acres of arable farmland and pasture. As he viewed it from passing over the apex of the bridge, the house seemed grander than he last remembered it. Still, with its 21 bedrooms and many en-suites, it looked more reminiscent of a palace than a country seat occupied by one man and 20 servants, for Algernon had never married and became a lifelong misogynist following the alleged rejection of the one woman in his life who refused his proposal of marriage. Looking very much a dashing squire, the tall, slim 60-year-old Lord Rothmeir greeted his brother with an outstretched hand from the entrance. He was wearing a hacking jacket, shirt, cravat, jodhpurs, and mud-splattered riding boots, apparently having just returned from a hunt on the estate. "By Jove," he said upon greeting Lionel, "we haven't seen you here for many of a year, dear brother. How the devil are you?" Despite years since they had last seen each other, he had lost nothing of that cold arrogance that even a forced smile had failed to conceal. As a child, he was always a bully and the centre of attention, and being the eldest, he was groomed to be the Lord of Rothmeir, while his erstwhile brother neither had the looks or the passage of right to be anything other than a second fiddle, and was treated as such. But his enduring quality was his heart, as he was known to be a kindly and generous child, the opposite of Algernon in every possible way. While servants carried his luggage up to his beautifully spacious front-facing bedroom, Lionel enjoyed having a high balcony which offered panoramic views across the lake and parkland. He later dressed for dinner and left his room to walk down the sweeping marble and gilt gold staircase, which took him from the hallway into a portrait-lined dining room. Algernon was sat at the head of the table, as befitted the squire of Rothmeir Hall, and a table waiter withdrew a mahogany Sheraton dining chair, upon which Lionel sat down next to his brother, who immediately engaged him in small talk, which lasted for the duration of dinner together. It was clear from his attitude and mannerisms that something was troubling him. Despite gentle probes by Lionel, he was not prepared to talk about matters other than past acquaintances and life serving the Queen and country in the military. Algernon preferred his old life, but now living this life was not to his liking. As heir to their father's wealth and estate, he seemed at least resigned to his fate, living in what Lionel thought was more of a gilded cage with benefits. Lionel inquired with Algernon about taking a pony and trap the following day, to ride around the estate to familiarise himself again with the memories he had held since he left Rothmeir so many years ago. Algernon was agreeable to that proposition and the opportunity to ride to his new parish to meet the staff and his soon-to-be parishioners, who were only a few miles away. Having withdrawn later to the drawing-room for more glasses of port with his brother, he retired to bed and peacefully slept once more in his family home before setting off early the following day on his rounds. The morning was warm and sunny, with a vaporizing mist clinging to the lake's surface. Having been assisted into the trap by a footman, he set off towards the lake, crafted earlier in the previous century by the most revered of all landscape architects, Lancelot Capability Brown. This vista of contrived beauty was fringed by steep embankments and fitted snugly among a forest of ash, oak and elm. As he crossed the stone bridge over the lake, he stopped briefly to admire the beautiful landscape stretched out on both sides for a few miles in either direction and set perfectly by weeping willows fringing the water's edge. He remembered that to the east of this was a stone folly in the form of a Grecian temple that his grandfather had commissioned so many years before and used as a family summer house, which still stood in elegant prominence overlooking the far bank, about a quarter of a mile distant from where he briefly stopped before continuing to arrive at the Folly a short while later. As he approached the building, which stood some 20 feet in diameter, he was surprised to observe a rather handsome-looking lady walking gracefully from the lakeside towards the Folly. She was young, slim and elegant, with long blonde tresses that bobbed gently on her shoulders and back. She was a sight to behold, as indeed she was a beautiful woman in many ways to the eyes of the admiring priest. Quite unaware of her identity, he stopped his trap and walked over to speak with her. Seemingly aware of his presence, she stopped briefly, turned around, smiled, and walked on before entering the building. Following behind, barely a few seconds away, he was shocked to discover that the entrance door she had just passed was locked or jammed tightly shut in the doorframe. Worse, the structure appeared neglected and unkempt, a far cry from his childhood memory. He then peered through the dusty and cobwebbed glass-panelled door, but despite rubbing the dirty glass, He could not see anyone within other than the fact that it had peeling paint and traces of dampness in the ceiling, which was still beautifully adorned with a fresco painted by the noted Italian artist Agostino Brunias in 1760, who was a friend of the architect Robert Adam, who coincidentally had also been engaged at the time with the rebuilding of Rothmeir Hall, from a brick and stone 14th century fortified manor house to the magnificent and much larger palatial home of today. History put aside, this disappearing woman was a fascinating mystery to him, and he decided later to ask his brother who this visitor might be. But first he had other matters to attend to, including meeting the staff at his new parish house and visiting the 11th century church to view the graves of his forebears. When he arrived at the vicarage at 2 p.m. that day, he was greeted by his cook, a redoubtable middle-aged lady named Mrs. Bright. Mrs. Bright also acted as housekeeper and supervised the staff, including a maid and a footman. She was a tall, large lady in her mid-50s who capably took up the post at the vicarage following her husband's untimely death 5 years earlier, and lived alone in staff lodgings within the 6-bedroom clergy house. Being a childless widow, life at the vicarage suited her. The meeting was, to say the least, rather than he had expected. She was aware of his relationship and connection to Rothmeir Hall and its owner, Lord Rothmeir, who appeared none too popular with her, and 2 parishioners who were present when he arrived. Knowing his brother's character and temperament, it was understandable, and Lionel went to great lengths to assuage any fears that he was of the same ilk. Having broken the ice, as it were, Mrs. Bright seemed much more relaxed and welcoming as she introduced the staff and the locals who were still present. Having been shown around his new home, a timber-framed and wainscoted 16th century house, and briefly visiting the church, he left for Rothmeir after leaving Mrs. Bright with instructions and a promise to return within a few days. Lionel was back in time for evening dinner and engaged his brother with the events of that day, obviously leaving out Mrs. Bright's initial doubts about Algernon. As was customary, he joined his brother later in the drawing room, where both settled down with another good bottle of port from the cellar. Here Lionel inquired about the identity of the lady he had seen by the lake and how she seemingly vanished after entering the Folly. Algernon's reaction was positively sour. Staring intently at his brother as he leaned forward, he said rather curtly, "You are mistaken, dear boy. The Folly hasn't been used in years and is always locked. How on earth could anyone enter under such conditions? You must have been confused by the light. It's pretty strong at that time of the day. However, I will ask my staff if they have any idea and to be on the lookout if she returns." From then on, the subjects discussed were estate management related and whether Lionel would like to accompany the gamekeeper the following day, as the estate had a fine stock of red deer, game birds and rabbits. Lionel was superficially interested because he had no intention of hunting due to his views on such matters and the infirmity of his health. Having finished off the port, both men retired to bed, and on the following morning he joined the gamekeeper, Mr. Tomkinson, who drove a 2-horse open carriage, which afforded plenty of space to relax on the ride around the estate. During the journey, Tomkinson commented on how the game is managed and also that the lake contained some fine trout, for which he was forever having problems with people fishing there illegally. He added that despite Lord Rothmeir being a local magistrate who swiftly dispensed fines or imprisonment on offenders, even that failed as a deterrent. While discussing trespassers, Lionel asked him about the mysterious lady by the lake. Tomkinson strangely became subdued and tried to change the subject, but Lionel had none of that and pressed him further. Shortly they stopped at the Temple Folly, and having disembarked from the carriage, he ushered Lionel over to the entrance. Looking somewhat nervous, he stared Lionel directly in the face and said, "Reverend, you asked about the lady. Yes, I have seen her once, as you described. I don't believe in ghosts. She looked pretty real when I first saw her. But when asking around, people say that she drowned here in mysterious circumstances, and some years ago after his lordship took over the estate. I was shocked, I can tell you. I do not know who she was, as it was before my time, but she might have been a member of the landed gentry. I heard she slipped and fell into the lake after spending the day here at the summer house and drowned. But for my life, I don't even know what happened afterwards. Your brother, Lord Rothmeir, apparently took charge of this and refused to discuss the matter further. He then paused and implored Lionel, "I beg of you not to mention this to his lordship, as he has a pretty nasty temper, and I fear losing my home here, which is a tied estate cottage. I hope you understand, Vicar." Lionel sympathetically touched his shoulder and assuringly replied, "As a man of God and the cloth, you have my word." A now more relaxed Tomkinson had a key to the entrance door, which opened fully after a good push. Once inside, it was apparent that nobody had set foot inside for many a year, and everything was coated with a fine layer of dust. Despite its neglected state, it still looked beautiful. The frescoes were still in good condition, as with the rest of the building, which had a domed leaded roof supported on 4 sandstone columns and was filled with glass window frames. The woodwork was complete and undamaged, but the paintwork was starting to blister with age, exposing the bare oak framework beneath. Although sadly dilapidated, it returned pleasant memories for Lionel. But unusually, he found some graffiti carved inside a heart on a Grecian-style wooden bench with the initials AS and GD 1865. He immediately recognized the carving style as his brother, and believed his initials confirmed this, but he pondered who GD was. He returned with the gamekeeper to the house, and with the aid of numerous Burke's Peerage editions found in the library, he looked for any information that might shed light on the identity of GD. After some hours of diligence, he discovered the announcement of the birth of a daughter, Geraldine Dampier, to Viscount and Lady Dampier on the 26th of April, 1844. The Dampiers, now extinct, formerly resided at Melrose House, a country estate some 5 miles distant from Rothmeir, which was destroyed by fire in 1866 with the loss of the parents, but no mention of their only daughter, who would have been 22 years old at the time. It was feasible that Geraldine Dampier may have left the family home to marry, but nothing could be confirmed. However, after reading several editions, Lionel found that this GD was the only one with a suitable social standing in the district who could have visited Rothmeir Hall. Realizing that Geraldine might be Algernon's lost love interest, he casually remarked on the discovery of the graffiti with him during dinner. Upon hearing of this, Algernon casually claimed it was news to him, and that perhaps the graffiti was caused by trespassers, as the summer house used to be left unlocked. But when Lionel asked about the Dampier family, he became quite indignant and slammed his knife and fork on the table, momentarily causing a wine bottle to rattle. With a raised voice, he stood up and said, "I don't want to talk about the Dampier family. They were nothing but problems for me." Although somewhat taken aback, Lionel responded that he had heard of the fire and wondered what happened to their daughter, Geraldine. He returned to his seat and said, somewhat calmer, "I am sorry for this outburst, but I have my reasons and do not wish to discuss these matters further." For the next few minutes, Algernon sat in silence and barely touched his meal before he left on the pretext of answering urgent correspondence. He said he would not be joining Lionel in the drawing room later. Lionel retired to his room for an early night, but the events surrounding Geraldine and her parents kept him awake for hours as he tried desperately to sleep. Eventually, in the small hours, he succumbed. But because of the lateness of the hour, he almost missed breakfast in the morning. Algernon, however, was nowhere to be seen, having left earlier to ride into town on business, according to the dining room maid. Using the opportunity in his brother's absence to leave unannounced, he took a pony and trap into his parish, hoping to find more information on the fire's circumstances and Geraldine's whereabouts. He felt confident that as a priest, someone somewhere would be able to fill in any missing details. His first call was with Mrs. Bright again at the vicarage. If anyone knew, he felt it would be her. When he arrived, she was busy cleaning the kitchen and seemed in no mood for chit-chat. Of course, realizing that Lionel was her employer, she stopped, quickly wiped her hands on her apron, smiled, and asked him politely if he needed anything. Lionel inquired about the fire at Melrose House and their daughter's fate. Before answering, she paused momentarily and took her eyes away from Lionel, apparently in a thoughtful mode, before taking a deep breath and replying rather solemnly, "Yes, I recall the fire. Terrible it was. It was believed an oil lamp tipped over in their bedroom as they lay asleep, and before help could get to them, they died. I'm not sure about the daughter, Lady Geraldine. I think she moved away sometime before the fire, but I can't be exact." She paused briefly. "And if I remember correctly, his lordship, your brother, was a frequent visitor there back in the day. He wasn't seen for weeks after that fire. I guess he was overcome with grief, as I thought he and the Dampiers were close friends. Yes, that's all I remember, Vicar." Her comments quietly shocked Lionel, for he recalled his brother's hostility, but he kept that to himself and went to the church records of births, marriages and deaths held in the vicarage's small library. Although he found the recorded birth of Geraldine and the death of her parents, nothing whatsoever was indicated of Geraldine's fate. He was sure his brother knew far more than he was prepared to say, so he focused more intently on the summer-house Folly and his irascible brother. Somewhere between the two, he mused, has to be the truth. Before returning to Rothmeir Hall, he sorted through some personal effects in preparation for his incumbency at the church. He arranged for the footman to repair his pony and trap, and unexpectedly, upon leaving, he saw Mrs. Bright standing in the hallway and holding what appeared to be a framed photograph in her hands. She rushed to Lionel and said, "I just remembered this, Vicar. It is a photograph of Lady Geraldine handing out an award to the village cricket team. It is undated, but it shows who she is, in case you meet her." He studied the image, and a sudden chill down his spine recognized that Lady Geraldine and the lady at the Folly were, in fact, the same person. More interesting to note was that she was depicted handing a trophy to the village cricket team's captain, with his brother caught standing behind them in clear view. And Algernon, he thought, looked quite unhappy as he stared somewhat sharply towards Geraldine. "Thank you, Mrs. Bright. This is indeed very interesting. May I borrow it to share with my brother, Lord Rothmeir? I am sure he'll be as interested as I am." With a smile, he left with the photograph to return one final time to Rothmeir Hall. He was expected to start his new post at the vicarage in 2 days, and some preparation was needed. On the journey back, he reflected again on all the information he had concerning his brother and the mysterious Lady Geraldine, and he thought it not unreasonable to suggest that Geraldine may be his unrequited love and his former objet de passion. But if the photo and the woman at the lake are the same, it is pretty apparent she is dead. But the mystery revolving around her passing remained unresolved. Lionel now felt sure that his brother may have murdered her or was involved in her death, and that perhaps in the lake or the grounds of Rothmeir her remains were hidden. Unfortunately, proving this to any authority would be impossible without hard evidence to back it up, other than a photograph and a ghost story. He sat for dinner that evening again with his brother, but never mentioned his suspicions, research, or the photograph. He knew that regardless, Algernon would deny any involvement and may, when confronted again, ask him to leave and ban him from returning. That evening, on the pretext of having to prepare his move to the vicarage, he returned to his room. As it was a fine warm evening, he sat on the balcony to relax for a few hours, reading a book before bed. From this viewpoint on the third floor, he enjoyed the panoramic view, which barely included the Folly, which was some distance away. As darkness drew in, he felt certain that a light could be faintly observed in that building. As it was twilight, he assumed his eyes were playing up and at first ignored it, but as it turned to darkness, the light seemed brighter and twinkled like someone was inside. Putting on suitable clothing and carrying a lamp, he felt emboldened to see who or what was inside at this unearthly hour. Before leaving, he crept into the library, where keys to estate properties were kept on a hook in a bookcase. Having liberated the key to the Folly, he proceeded on foot towards this building, which was some 15 minutes or so away from the house. Under normal circumstances, he would be wary of making such a journey, but he prayed for divine protection and set off alone. As he got closer, the Folly was indeed illuminated, and from 50 yards distant, he saw a figure of someone inside moving around. Of course, the dirty cobweb windows obscured clarity, and it was only when he reached the locked entrance door that he saw inside the form of a woman who looked perfectly solid and real. He could now see with certainty that it was Geraldine, and he could also observe that she was staring at him and pointing at the floor quite sternly. As he opened the door, it suddenly went dark inside and absolutely nothing. He walked around the interior, holding his lamp high, but it was empty. He then realized Geraldine may have actually provided him with proof of where she was interred. Although this manifestation's appearance was naturally disconcerting, his curiosity about resolving it overtook any fears or apprehensions he most certainly harbored. He saw that the floor was laid with thick oak planks, and resting on his knees, he realized that the middle section appeared quite loose when a pocket knife blade was introduced between each plank. His suspicions now appeared confirmed as to where she was buried, but being a prominent local figure, he knew he would have to officially report this to the police to get them to organize a warrant to enter the property to carry out an excavation. He also knew this would prove impossible, as his brother was the local squire and magistrate, and his evidence of this crime would prove incredulous beyond rational belief. Instead, he decided to hatch a plan to catch his brother in flagrante delicto. During breakfast, he met Algernon in the dining room and told him everything that had happened the night before, substituting Geraldine's ghost with a real man. He suggested that he appeared to be showing an unusual interest in the floor and was trying to prise the boards up. He thought he was probably a local man trying to steal the wood because they were quality oak and had value. He added that when he challenged the man who, realizing that Lionel was a man of the cloth, pushed him to the ground and fled. Lionel added that the door was undamaged and unlocked, but after the man disappeared into the night, he locked it himself as he had the key from the library. He knew that getting the police there promptly was pointless at this late hour, as the man had since long gone, and for the same reason, he didn't report it that night to his brother, as nothing had been stolen or damaged. Algernon looked quite sweaty as he listened to Lionel's detailed account. Instead of going into one of his characteristic rages, he said he would make inquiries and deal with this problem personally. He thanked his brother, and as Lionel was leaving that morning for the vicarage, he said he would visit him soon at his new post. Lionel was sure that Algernon would now probably visit the Folly that evening to remove any remains of Geraldine under the cloak of darkness, as to do so during the day might alert any number of his employees. After breakfast, Algernon's servants loaded Lionel's luggage onto a horse and cart and took him and his belongings onto the vicarage. After arriving at his new home, he instructed his staff to remove the luggage from the cart and unpack it while he went for a walk around the village. In truth, he went out to seek the village policeman, P.C. Reginald Oliver, a moustached ex-military man in his late 40s who lived in the station house with his wife and children. As he discovered, Oliver had served in India before joining the police. Both men spent an enjoyable hour together exchanging anecdotes over a mug of tea served by his wife, Grace. It was clear that P.C. Oliver enjoyed Lionel's company, and now he intended to enlist the officer as an innocent confederate in the second part of his scheme. He told P.C. Oliver the same story he had shared with Algernon. He suggested that as his brother may be away, he would be prepared to accompany the officer if free to the Folly, hoping to catch the would-be thief returning during the darkness. P.C. Oliver readily agreed and arranged to meet by the estate's main entrance gate at 10 p.m. that night. The walk to the Folly from here with a shortcut through woodland would take minutes. Having now all the arrangements in place, he later met P.C. Oliver as agreed, who arrived on his police cycle, which he had left hidden just inside the trees as he accompanied Lionel on foot. Sure enough, on their approach, they could see the Folly was illuminated by what appeared to be a hurricane lamp, and inside they saw a man digging feverishly into the floor, with the floorboards neatly stacked to one side. P.C. Oliver immediately stepped inside and was about to apprehend the man when he realized Algernon was digging. "Oh, I'm sorry, my lord," he said apologetically, "but I received a report from the Reverend here that someone may be planning to steal the oak floorboards." Red-faced, P.C. Oliver was about to make excuses to leave when he saw in the hole the barely unearthed rotted remains of a blonde woman wearing the tattered remnants of a dress. Shocked at such a horrific sight, P.C. Oliver exclaimed, "Hang on, sir, that's a body lying there. Could you care to explain this?" Algernon, still holding a spade, immediately reacted by attempting to swing it in a rage at the officer, who was quick to dart out of the way of a glancing blow before lunging himself at Algernon as he attempted to make good his escape. Once restrained, as Algernon was no match for the officer's size and strength, P.C. Oliver arrested him on suspicion of murder and the unlawful disposal of a dead body. Algernon, with eyes of fiery temper, screamed at his brother, "It was you that set this up, you blackguard, and now I am done for." Lionel felt no satisfaction in his brother's betrayal and looked down at his feet to avert Algernon's crazed gaze as P.C. Oliver took him, restrained and handcuffed, through the door. Still, morally, he knew he did the right thing, and now his brother would inevitably face justice for this terrible crime, and hopefully Lady Geraldine would finally be laid to rest. At no time did Lionel admit to his sighting of Lady Geraldine's ghost, realizing that the newspapers would have a field day with this national news story, which ran for weeks in the press, at home and abroad. Algernon later appeared at the Old Bailey, where he pled guilty to the charges of murdering Lady Geraldine by strangulation and also of murdering her parents by arson. They had suspected he killed their daughter and had threatened to expose Algernon to the authorities. Rather than risk a police inquiry, he decided it would be simpler to be rid of them by burning down their 14th century timber-framed home with a lit oil lamp thrown through a leaded window. Earlier during the trial, when asked by prosecution counsel why he killed Lady Geraldine, he simply said that Geraldine was his only true love, and having rejected him, he strangled her in a fit of rage in the summer house where he later buried her. He added that she tormented him for years from the grave every night in his sleep, but he now felt at rest with himself and could sleep peacefully again. Algernon, to his credit, fully admitted to these crimes as he wanted a clear conscience before facing his inevitable fate on the hangman's rope after having been sentenced before his peers for these abominable murders. The estate, title and wealth later passed into Lionel's guardianship. Still with no heirs to pass the estate on to, he wanted none of the now tarnished family name and reputation, so he disposed of the estate property and assets. The proceeds were then distributed through a trust fund to support children's orphanages at home and abroad. As Lady Geraldine had no surviving family, Lionel agreed to officiate at her funeral, with Mrs. Bright and villagers present as mourners. While she was being laid to rest next to her parents in the family vault at Rothmeir Church, someone reported that they briefly saw Lady Geraldine among the 20-odd mourners present, although, of course, none of this could be confirmed. But from this moment Lady Geraldine's ghost was never seen again, and Lionel went to his grave a few years later, a quietly contented man. The end. To end 2024, I wrote this story literally from scratch. I never write with any predefined ideas or any structural order of events. I simply allow my imagination to transcribe my thoughts onto digital paper, and often the story evolves on its own, developing new twists and turns that usually surprises me when I finally finish. This story took a day over Christmas, and I have to say I am rather pleased with the end product. Occasionally, as I write, I develop new avenues into the story, which sometimes lead in an exciting direction, or I scrap and reimagine the whole piece. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this, and please tell me what you think. Wishing you all a wonderful new year and the very best for 2025.